Chapter 16 of The Gladstone Colony, an unwritten chapter of Australian history, by James Francis Hogan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. From the mass of speeches, pronouncements and writings of Mr Gladstone on colonial affairs, I select one utterance for separate and particular notice, insomuch as it is the most striking and suggestive, the most elaborate and eloquent, the most comprehensive and closely reasoned of all his addresses on the relations between the mother country and her daughter lands beyond the seas. It is his speech on the second reading of the New Zealand Government Bill in the House of Commons on the 21st of May 1852. On that occasion, Mr Gladstone formulated what he conceived to be the true principles of colonisation. New Zealand was a colony in which Mr Gladstone would naturally feel a warm personal interest. His relative by marriage, Lord Lyttelton, was one of the founders of the New Zealand province of Canterbury, and amongst the Canterbury Pilgrims, as they were known in local history, or pioneer settlers, were several of Mr Gladstone's early friends and acquaintances. Moreover, the first Anglican Bishop of New Zealand, Dr George Augustus Selwyn, was Mr Gladstone's closest companion at Eton and an intimate friend in later life. Mr Gladstone maintained correspondence with his old friends amongst the Canterbury Pilgrims, notably the Hon. J.E. Fitzgerald, who became the first Premier of New Zealand. The reading of a remarkable letter from this gentleman constituted a dramatic episode in the speech of Mr Gladstone on the second reading of the Home Rule Bill in 1893. At the outset of his speech on the New Zealand Government Bill 45 years ago, Mr Gladstone said he was not aware of a single case of a colony dealt with by recent legislation in which a just and what he might call, for sake of precision, a normal relation between the colony and the mother country had been arrived at. By the term normal relation, he did not mean a relation founded upon the speculations of philosophers or economists alone, but he meant a relation which had been developed in the world of actual life, and which, with regard to its leading outlines and all its essential features, was the old relation that in former times, although it was the custom to ridicule those times as having been comparatively unenlightened, subsisted between the mother country and the North American colonies. The prevalent conception of a colony, as it appeared to him, was this: it was regarded as something which had its centre of life in an executive government. The establishment of a colony was viewed as something which was to take effect by legislative enactments, or by the executive power of the Crown, or by the funds of the people of England. This administrative establishment, according to the present colonial system, was the root and trunk around which, by degrees, a population was to grow, under which, by degrees, that population was, according to a modern and in this case most unhappy phrase, to be trained for freedom, and to which, in course of time, some modicum of free institutions was to be granted. That, he thought, was a true description of the manner in which, and of the idea under which, the foundation of the modern British colonies had been ordinarily conducted. Now he conceived that a fundamental difference prevailed between the colonial policy pursued during recent years and the policy pursued in the other departments of the state. In the Home Department, the financial arrangements of the country, the Foreign Office, certain leading principles were continuously carried out, and upon these leading principles there was a general concurrence of opinion, so that, for example, no person ever seriously proposed to alter the fundamental principles upon which the foreign policy of the country had been conducted by a long succession of ministers. But that which he thought required still more and more to be presented to the mind of the House and of the people of England, until it became with them a living and a practical conviction, was this proposition, that in the policy they had pursued in the foundation of colonies — he spoke of free and planted colonies, not military posts, or colonies whose social relations were disturbed by questions of race — they had proceeded on principles fundamentally wrong, and that the acts introduced and passed by the Imperial Parliament for the purpose of raising, by slow and reluctant degrees, the structure of freedom in those colonies were not so much recognitions of a right principle as modifications, qualifications, and restraints imposed upon a wrong principle. Now, what was this right principle of colonisation to which he referred? It might, in his view, be enunciated in one word, or at least one phrase, to which he would presently come. Their ancestors 200 years ago, when they proceeded to found colonies, did not do it by coming down to the House of Commons with an estimate prepared, and asking so many thousands a year for a governor, a judge, an assistant judge, a colonial secretary, and a large apparatus of minor officers. What they did was this. They collected together a body of free men destined to found a free state in another hemisphere upon principles of freedom analogous to those of the parent state, which should grow up by a principle of increase intrinsic to itself, and enjoying that freedom, under the shelter from foreign aggression from civilised powers, which the imperial power of England was to afford them, should, in process of time, propagate the language, manners, institutions, and religion of the English nation in distant quarters of the globe. But it was not on artificial support from home that these colonies leaned, and the consequence was that they advanced with a rapidity which, considering the undeveloped state of communications and of commerce at the time, was little less than miraculous. That was the consequence to them, and the consequence to the mother country was this. The home exchequer was never troubled with pecuniary charges for their maintenance. On the contrary, they were ever ready to assist England in time of war, and instead of being called on to send regiments, service companies, and he knew not what else besides, to maintain the domestic police of those colonies and keep the peace for them against unruly members of their own communities or against savage tribes upon their borders, such was their admiration of freedom and such their profitable use of it, that not only did they not ask for regiments and service companies, or petition for means to keep the peace, but they held it as a grievance if England attempted to impose upon them her little standing armies, and they considered that, having been educated in English habits and ideas, they were perfectly competent to follow out for themselves the paths in which these habits and ideas conducted them. Such was the then state of things. Departing from that scheme of policy in later days, they had implanted a principle, if not absolute, yet of comparative feebleness in their distant settlements. They had brought upon themselves enormous expense, and by depriving their distant colonies of the fullness of political freedom, they had deprived them of the greatest attraction that could possibly be held out to the best part of the population to emigrate, because Englishmen did not love to emigrate to countries where they could not enjoy the political franchises which they enjoyed at home, and where the regulation of their interests would be committed to the hands of a government which, however mild and equitable, must still be called in principle despotic. Whatever might be said as to despotism, and he was not disposed to take an over-severe view of it, where it was adapted to the habits and social conditions of a country, yet, as regards free-born Englishmen, such a system was most monstrous and irrational, and the consequence had been that there was a subject of complaint present and familiar to them all, namely, the great difficulty in getting the superior classes of the community to emigrate. For the high-minded, well-educated men, who would have been themselves the centres of a valuable social influence, had been reluctant to leave the shores of England, because they were unwilling to forfeit the advantages of a state of high civilization and to incur a certain deprivation of the great bulk of their political liberties. And thus their modern colonists, instead of remaining, as in former times, in continuous and hereditary possession of their liberties after quitting the mother country, instead of keeping and handing them on as the regular and unquestioned heritage of their children in another hemisphere, went out to Australia or New Zealand to be deprived of those liberties, and then, perhaps, after 15, 20 or 30 years waiting, to have a portion given back to them with great and magnificent language about the liberality of the Imperial Parliament in conceding free institutions. During all that time, they were condemned to hear the whole of the miserable jargon about training them for free institutions and fitting them for the privileges thus conferred, whereas, in point of fact, so far from thus training and fitting them, every year during which they were kept out of the possession and the familiar use of such institutions and retained under the administration of a despotic government, rendered them less fit for free institutions, and the consequence was that when free institutions were at length introduced, great embarrassments ensued. Liberty came as a novelty. Its working was something strange and unknown, attended with hazard, uncertainty, and excitement, and thus inconvenient or disastrous consequences were brought about, which might have been avoided by following that which, in this case, no one need be ashamed of holding up to commendation as the wisdom of their ancestors, and walking in the path they had struck out for the guidance of future generations. Let the people sent out to colonise a distant land take root unmolested in their new ground, as the seed of a future community, as the natural and living centre which population was to grow. And instead of training them for free institutions, let it be remembered that the best training they could have was the training they had already received before quitting the shores of England, and while they were still British citizens. Let them carry their freedoms with them, even as they carried their agricultural implements or anything else necessary to establish them in their new abodes. So let them hold it for themselves, and so let them transmit it to their children. That was the true secret of subduing the difficulties of colonisation. In propagating these opinions, he did not rest upon the speculations of philosophers and economists. He rested upon the facts of history. The system which he recommended, and which he was convinced would gain ground from year to year in the feelings and convictions of the country, was the very same system, in the main, as that on which the whole of the great and wonderful operation in colonising North America was conducted, the system which Edmund Burke studied, examined, and comprehended from top to bottom, and which he described in his great speech on American taxation, when he warned the Imperial Parliament against the erroneous and destructive consequences of attempting to establish administrative power over their distant dependencies, or to extract from them some miserable and contemptible pecuniary benefit, instead of seeing that the great interest and purpose of England in colonising was the multiplication of her race, that her policy was to trust to the multiplication of her race for the propagation of her institutions, and that whatever course of legislation tended most to the rapid expansion of population and power in her colonies, necessarily tended most to enhance the reflected benefits that she was to derive from their foundation. That sound colonial policy reached its climax in what might be called Tory times, although they were times immediately preceding the invention of the now familiar political designations. In 1662, the Charter of Rhode Island was granted. It was the most remarkable of all the early charters for its enlarged and liberal spirit, yet in its general character it was akin to the rest of the charters, under which the infant settlements of New England throve and prospered. At the present day, it was considered a monstrous idea that colonies should have a free local jurisdiction for local purposes. It was not considered safe to allow colonies to pass at their own discretion a rule relating to the making of a road, the deepening of a harbour, or any local purpose, so that an act of this kind, after passing a colonial legislature, nay, even after receiving the governor's assent, was not secure from reversal, but was still, as it were, in a state of suspended existence for 2 years and upwards. It was remitted to England, considered in England, and again sent to the colonies, and thus, until the news was received there, its fate was uncertain. In point of fact, a period of nearly 3 years might elapse in the distant colonies between their final decision on local questions, the only criterion of fitness in this case that was worth a moment's attention, and their final knowledge whether the decision was to take effect. That was the state in which they were placed, and the way in which their affairs were managed. He should like to know what the feelings, temper, and humour of the English people at home would be, if this were the mode of dealing with laws passed by them on subjects which they understood, say, for instance, an act on the construction of a great western railroad, or other similar purpose. If such an act, passed on their own knowledge of the circumstances and exigencies of the case, were to be transmitted to another quarter of the world, and there kept by somebody in an office for 2 years, while some person or persons unknown were deliberating upon its fate. Yet that was the system under which, in this age of freedom and enlightenment, they were content that their colonies should subsist. The old idea of a colony might be represented, as he had said at the beginning of his remarks, by a single phrase. It was, in fact, the idea of a municipal corporation. Now, it would be useful to consider the sense attached to that phrase. In the departure from it was to be found the key of the alteration of their colonial policy from the old model. They did not treat their municipalities with the same system of misplaced absolutism that they applied to their colonies. They placed their municipalities under the restraint of the general law of the land, but for purposes properly local they were endowed with absolute freedom. The bylaws of Liverpool or of Manchester, places counting their population by hundreds on hundreds of thousands, were not sent to the Secretary of the Home Department to be kept for 2 years, that he might consider whether they were to be carried into effect or not, but they went into operation at once. Would it be possible for them, by any strain of imagination, to realise to themselves what the condition of such municipalities would be if that were not so? Such a system would seem to them fitter for Turkey than for England. The colonial system of their ancestors was well considered, and was founded on the dictates of political justice. The colonies were subjected, on one hand, to the general restraints of the law of England, and again, according to the language of their charters, they were to have their own laws as near as might be agreeable to the laws of England, whilst in other respects they were, for all practical purposes, absolutely and entirely free. Furthermore, he would say that the degenerate and degrading ideas they now had of retaining the substance of colonial patronage partly, and still more the name, in the home country for the supposed benefit of ministers or influence of the Crown, were totally foreign to the notions of their ancestors 6 generations ago. The colonies at that time, on the general basis of municipal corporations, were the possessors of their own soil. They were, for all purposes of police, except that of conflict with civilised powers, the defenders of their own frontiers. They were the bearers of their own charges. They were the electors of their own officers, and they were the makers of their own laws. Every one of those salutary principles had been reversed within the last 70 years. They now retained at home the management of, and property in, colonial lands. They had magnificent sums figuring on their estimates for the ordinary expenses of colonial governments, instead of allowing these governments to bear their own expenses. Instead of allowing the colonies to judge what were the measures best adapted to secure their peaceful relations with the Aboriginal tribes, they were told, "You must not meddle with the relations between yourselves and the natives. That is a matter for the Imperial Parliament." A minister sitting in Downing Street determined how the local relations between the inhabitants of a colony and the Aboriginal tribes were to be settled in every point, down to the minutest detail. Nay, even their strictly internal police, Imperial troops were often called upon to maintain. The idea of their electing their own officers was regarded as revolutionary in the extreme. If not invading the royal supremacy, it was something almost as bad, dismembering the empire. And as to making their own laws upon local affairs without home interference or control, that was really an innovation so opposed to all ideas of imperial policy that he thought his honourable friend, the member for Southwark, Sir William Molesworth, was the first man in the House bold enough to propose it. Thus, in fact, the principles on which colonial administration was once conducted had been precisely reversed. The colonies had come to be looked upon as being not municipalities endowed with local freedom, but petty states. If the fundamental idea of their forefathers had been adhered to, that colonies were municipal bodies, founded within the shadow and cincture of the imperial power of England, that, having imposed on them such positive restraints as were thought necessary, they were left free in everything else, all those principles, instead of having been reversed, would have survived in full vigour. Millions would have been saved to the imperial exchequer, and something far more important would have been done by planting societies more worthy by far of the source from which they sprang. For no man could read the history of the great American Revolution without seeing that 100 years ago the colonies, such as they were, with the institutions they then possessed, and the political relations in which they then stood to the mother country, bred and reared men of mental stature and power, such as far surpassed anything that colonial life was now commonly considered to be capable of producing. The Charter of Rhode Island was, on the whole, the best and most perfect exhibition of the ancient maxims of colonisation. Its constitution consisted of 3 orders: a governor, a body of assistants, and a body of freemen. The freemen, as it was anticipated in the Charter that they would become more numerous, were to meet by representation, and thus in these elected freemen, with a distinct order of assistants, a principle was laid down, the principle of the double chamber for legislation, which had stood the storm of the American Revolution and the strain of all subsequent political vicissitudes, and which at present subsisted with undiminished vigour in every single state of the American Union. But further, while the first governor was named in the Charter and was to hold office for a year, his successors were to be appointed by the free voice of the colonists, and doubtless to many it would appear astonishing that that power should have been conceded in 1662, when not merely the warmth but the fever of royalism was at its height in England. They were not only to elect their own government, but to make their own laws, subject to no other restraint in the world, except that, as far as circumstances would permit, such laws would not be contrarious but agreeable to the laws of England. They were to appoint their own officers and judges. They were to constitute their own courts of justice. They were to arm, embody and march their own force for self-defence, and appoint its commanders. They were to be the possessors of their own soil, and lastly, they were to be the bearers of their own charges. It might be asked what security was taken for their good behaviour to others. The security taken, whether perfect or not, was certainly as perfect as any more recent policy had furnished. It was provided that in the event of their offending any prince or power in alliance with the Crown of England, they should either be bound to make restitution to the satisfaction of the Crown, or else, in the words of the Charter, they "shall be put out of their allegiance and protection." Now 2 centuries had passed and had produced many changes in the character of mankind, and he would not say that in all points which might now be in debate the Rhode Island Charter ought to be implicitly and blindly imitated. But this he would say, that looking to the constitutions given of late years to the colonies, the acts they had passed, the difficulties that had followed, the millions paid from the imperial exchequer for the suppression of insurrections and for the maintenance of wars with savages, the worrying processes to which colonists had been subjected, the complaints on all sides of the deteriorated tone of society in many of the dependencies, the reluctance, once universal and still somewhat prevalent, of educated and superior men to cast their lot and make their home in the colonies. Noticing all this, and remembering that 200 years ago a system conceived in another spirit was carried out by their forefathers, they surely could not draw the comparison, he should rather say the contrast, without a blush upon their faces. Having thus reviewed the general aspects of colonial policy, Mr Gladstone proceeded to address himself to the particular bill before the House for the better government of New Zealand. On the whole, the bill was, in his opinion, creditable to Her Majesty's Government, not because it went back to the system generally represented by the Rhode Island Charter, but because it indicated a real intention to approximate to that system, and conceded a larger measure of freedom than had hitherto been given under parliamentary enactment to any of the colonies. His right honourable friend, the member for Southwark, had complained of the bill as recognising too much the political existence of the local settlements, and had suggested that it should be left to the central legislature to create local political authorities according to the dictates of expediency. On the contrary, he must say, notwithstanding his respect for the authority of Sir William Molesworth and general concurrence in the views of his honourable friend on colonial policy, that he thought the recognition of these local settlements was one of the most excellent features of the bill. One of the characteristics of modern legislation, as far as the colonies were concerned, had been its arbitrary character. They, in the Imperial Parliament, had endeavoured to draw lines for themselves, instead of following those which nature and subsisting circumstances had marked out for them. It was, in his opinion, a mistake to suppose that a large amount of population was required to constitute a self-governing political society. The right honourable gentleman, the Secretary for the Colonies, had said, "Here are 6 settlements, the inhabitants of which are united by proximity to one another, by common pursuits and relations, in a great degree by common ideas, and a common industry and trade, but generally separated from one another by wide intervals of space." Well, there was, if he might so call it, the social unit, and the right honourable gentleman had recognised it and had departed from the modern traditions of colonial policy by granting a considerable share of political power to those small communities, working independently one of the other. In this arrangement he was glad to find a protest against those attempts to centralise by law where there was no sufficient attraction to a natural centre, which could only produce weakness and dissatisfaction. When he considered how well an opposite system had worked in North America, when he considered how much of the character of the Union and its stability depended on the strict division into states and the rigid maintenance of their separate authority and jurisdiction, he did not hesitate to say that the recognition of these small communities in New Zealand, which would have a substantive political existence of their own, while, at the same time, they were associated together for other more general purposes, was, in his view, one of the fundamental merits of the bill, and promised, nay, constituted, a real advance in the spirit of British colonial policy. He came now to the passing of laws, and observed with satisfaction that the right honourable gentleman had introduced the thin end of the wedge, although it was a very thin end indeed, to relax and finally, as he hoped, to break up the present system. It was now for the first time proposed by a minister that bills might be passed by a colonial legislature and might finally pass into law without being subject to what was termed the veto at home. The district legislatures of New Zealand were to be empowered to make their own laws upon all subjects, with certain specified exceptions. These acts were to be liable to veto only from the Governor of New Zealand, and although an unduly prolonged period of time was assigned him for the exercise of that power, yet, in principle, the concession was important, for if that officer should not think fit, these measures would never be heard of in Downing Street as subjects for deliberation at all. Now, this was a matter in which much care and consideration were requisite, and the ground had to be carefully measured and ascertained before going to the extreme length which, on general principles might be thought desirable. But keeping those principles in view, he thanked the right honourable gentleman for the qualified recognition of them by the provisions of the bill. Another valuable feature of the measure was the arrangement proposed with regard to the composition of the smaller or district legislatures. Here again the right honourable gentleman had had the courage to burst the bonds of another most mischievous modern superstition. He meant the superstition which prevailed that a certain number of nominees should be introduced into the legislative constitution of the colonies in order to maintain what was called the just influence of the Crown. The right honourable gentleman had provided that in the district legislatures there should be only one house or chamber. This he so far regretted that he would have preferred a plan based upon the old distribution into the two orders of assistants and freemen, but as there was to be only one chamber, he was heartily glad that there were to be no nominees in it. No Crown influence was to be cherished by such spurious means. Election, and election only, was to prevail, and the Secretary of State had delivered himself and them from the idea, which had sat upon them in former times like a nightmare, that a colonial constitution could not work without an infusion of nominated members, a device that, so far as he could perceive, had no purpose except that of sowing and perpetuating dissension. The right honourable gentleman had moreover made another step in advance, a step much in accordance with the old spirit by which the first British colonies were guided, in proposing to hand over with certain restrictions the control of their own land to the colonists. Now, this he took to be no small merit in the bill, especially when he reminded the House that 2 years previously, when they were invited to legislate for New South Wales, it was in vain that some members urged upon the Government and upon the Parliament the necessity and equity of doing the same thing. The bill gave to the colonists of New Zealand that right of dealing with their own lands, which was refused in 1850 to the more mature and powerful colony of New South Wales, and although the boon was clogged with objectionable conditions, yet by it the right honourable gentleman showed that in principle he was willing to assent to the demand made by the colonists in regard to this weighty particular. Mr Gladstone then proceeded to discuss a variety of details of the bill, once more citing the example and authority of the United States, which he described as, quote, the great source of experimental instruction so far as the colonies are concerned, end quote. Against the proposal to make the Upper House or Legislative Council of the Central Parliament of New Zealand a body of nominees, Mr Gladstone entered an earnest and eloquent protest. In this important particular, he said, the plan of the present Colonial Secretary differed, and he must say greatly degenerated, from the plan of Lord Grey. Having had the misfortune frequently to differ from that noble lord on questions of colonial policy, it was with the greatest pleasure that he acknowledged the excellence of his plan in this particular respect. Lord Grey's intention was that the Legislative Council should be composed of persons elected by the district legislatures. It was quite plain whence he had derived that hint. It was from the United States of America, and in going to the Constitution of the United States to draw hints and suggestions for the improvement of modern colonial institutions, Lord Grey had resorted to the very best foundation of instruction founded upon experience. If there was one thing in the Constitution of the United States which, more than others, entitled the great authors of that astonishing work to the gratitude of their countrymen and to fame as wide and lasting as the world, it was the system which they had devised for the election of the Senate, which, proceeding on the principle of providing for the election of senators from separate states, each considered as a unit and all as equal, established a check on the power of mere numbers or pure popular election. In practice, it had been found most difficult to work the system of nominated legislative councils in the colonies, and as regards political principle and opinion, it was the party favourable to stability which was endeavouring to get rid of those nominated bodies and to substitute elective councils in their place. The real truth was that they had here another of those vulgar superstitions which it was necessary to protest against from year to year until they became effectually and utterly exploded. The superstition which induced men to believe that it was right to have a body of legislators in the colonies appointed by the Crown for the purpose of checking the free action of popular sympathies. If it were true that the home country had a set of interests distinct from the interests of the colony in respect to its local affairs, the Imperial Parliament would be acting on a sound and right principle in making provision for the separate and independent maintenance of those interests. But it was not so. The mother country had no conceivable interest apart from those of the colonies. What served their purpose best served its purpose best. The notion of setting up a body of men by nomination, who were to be representatives of the interests of the home country, which were no interests at all, was a most gross and serious error, not merely one of those idle errors that lay by in the lumber room and did no good and no harm, but an error full of practical mischief and tending to keep up that intermeddling in the local concerns of the colonies, which was so prolific of weakness to the mother country and of vexation to her colonial children. Another point to which he must refer had relation to the New Zealand Company. An honourable member had spoken of the disinterested conduct of that company, and he did not at all question that patriotic motives had governed the gentlemen who formed its directorate, but he must confess that for colonial purposes, when companies of this nature got beyond the purely commercial business of bringing the capital of the old country into contact with the soil of the new, he looked upon them with ineradicable jealousy. So long ago as the time of Adam Smith, they had acquired the ill repute of being the greatest obstacles to the well-being of colonies. They had one most unfortunate instance of this in the case of the Hudson's Bay Company, which spread a death-like shade over a large region of North America. He objected altogether to the management at home of the local affairs of colonies, such as they now had in view. But if they were to have government from home, let it be the Queen's government, let it be the government on that Treasury bench, the government they could face and interrogate, with which they could argue, and whose errors they could expose and condemn. But as to companies of this kind, which fell into the hands of irresponsible individuals, into which necessarily a narrow spirit crept, and a spirit that gradually became more and more narrow, he looked upon them with the greatest jealousy, when once they got beyond that which he had ventured to characterise as their proper sphere. No doubt there might be exceptions, and the New Zealand Company might be one of these. He certainly did not mean to draw a comparison between it and the Hudson's Bay Company, but he maintained that too much of territorial power and of political relation had belonged to it. The right honourable gentleman, the Secretary of State, had thought fit, following the traditions of his department in this particular instance, that the settlers in New Zealand, composed of Englishmen and natives as intelligent as Britons at home, that each one of the 6 districts of the colony should be governed by a superintendent, who was not to be elected, but who was to be nominated by the Governor of New Zealand, and that this functionary should have provided for him, by the parental care of the home government, a salary of £500 per annum. Now, he would respectfully suggest that if they could get rid of both the nomination and the salary, it would be a great improvement in the bill. From what source was it that political appointments derived their attractiveness and honour? He had the distinction of sitting in an assembly of 600 gentlemen who gave their laborious services to the country without fee or reward. They had, again, in the service of the state, a great multitude of salaried officers, yet no man could say that these salaried officers, many of them bringing distinction as well as emolument, were coveted more than a seat in the House of Commons. Why was such a seat, with the heavy burden of duties attached to it, so coveted? Because every seat in the House of Commons was a mark of the confidence of a portion of their fellow countrymen. That confidence stood instead of money, and it did the work of money better than money itself could do. If these New Zealand colonies were allowed to choose out from among themselves whom they believed to be the best men, it would be found, without undertaking to provide a salary of £500 a year, that the office would become the object of honourable competition. It would be, in addition, he ventured to predict, the means of making the colony attractive in a degree far greater than at present, and of drawing from England to New Zealand men of a different class, men of a higher class than could ever be got to go in numbers to any of the colonies, until the colonies were stamped with the same broad and deep and indelible character of freedom which had been marked upon all their home institutions. Sir John Pakington, the Secretary of State for the Colonies, followed Mr Gladstone in the debate, and referred to the eloquence and ability of his speech, adding that he had listened to it with the greatest pleasure. At a subsequent stage, Sir John described Mr Gladstone's speech as, quote, an essay upon our colonial system. End quote. End of chapter 16. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Chapter 17 of The Gladstone Colony, an unwritten chapter of Australian history by James Francis Hogan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Mr. Gladstone and the Colonies. The maiden speech of Mr. Gladstone in the House of Commons, delivered on the 17th of May 1833, was on a colonial subject. It was, in point of fact, a reply to an attack made on Mr. Gladstone's father by Lord Howick, who had recently relinquished the post of Under Secretary for the Colonies in connection with the treatment of slaves on the Gladstone estate in Demerara. "The noble lord," said Mr. Gladstone, "has attempted to impugn the character of the gentleman acting as manager of my father's estates, and in making this selection he has certainly been most unfortunate, for there is not an individual in the colony more proverbial for humanity and the kind treatment of his slaves than Mr. Maclean. That gentleman has acted in judicial capacities, and has during his long residence been appointed to very important trusts. I hold in my hand 2 letters from Mr. Maclean, in which that gentleman speaks in the kindest terms of the people under his charge, describes their state of happiness, content, and healthiness, and recommends certain additional comforts which he says the slaves well deserve." Mr. Gladstone returned to the charge on June 3rd, and entered into a still more elaborate defence of the management of his father's sugar plantations in Demerara, but without convincing Lord Howick, who rose immediately afterwards and said that he "saw nothing in the statements of the honourable member who had just sat down that would shake his former arguments. In Demerara there was a great temptation to enact an undue quantity of labour, and the slaves were fast perishing." As Under Secretary for the Colonies, Mr. Gladstone introduced on the 19th of March 1835 a bill of a very beneficent character for the improvement of the conditions under which emigrants were carried from England to new homes beyond the seas. He expressed a hope that there would be no opposition to the measure, as humanity and good feeling required some legislative enactment on the subject of immigration. The question involved was one of no small importance to the community. It was not necessary for him to impress upon the House that anything which affected the comfort of the thousands of emigrants who quitted their shores every year was worthy of their attention, especially when it was borne in mind that the class in question was the poorest in their midst. The provisions of his bill were comparatively few, and he would give a brief outline of them to the House. In the first place, it was found that under the existing system, the emigrants, during the voyage and on their arrival, were subjected to a variety of restrictions and expenses, which, as they were generally persons possessed of but small means, were in most cases destructive of their future prospects. That was one of the abuses which his bill proposed to remedy. The next provision of the bill would make it compulsory on owners and masters of vessels to retain emigrants, if the latter so desired, for 48 hours on board after the arrival of the ship. The reason for this provision was found in the expense and inconvenience which these poor people experienced on being thrust out like beasts of the field into a strange place without lodging or shelter. It was, therefore, most desirable that they should have the privilege of remaining on board the vessel for a period after their arrival. The bill also proposed to limit the number of passengers on emigrant ships and to increase the quantity of food. It provided that every ship upwards of 100 passengers should have a surgeon on board, and that every craft carrying under that number should have a medicine chest. Next, the master would be responsible for the contracts entered into with emigrants by the accredited agents of owners, because much misery had recently resulted from a non-fulfilment of contracts by agents in some of the outports. It was but justice to these poor people that the owners should be responsible for the acts of their agents, and the master was the individual most accessible in a distant port, or even at home. It was finally proposed to make the penalties inflicted by the bill recoverable by summary process before 2 magistrates, either in England or any of the British colonies. The bill passed into law before the close of the session without encountering much opposition. The first speech of Mr. Gladstone on a colonial subject, fully reported in Hansard, is one he delivered on the 8th of March 1837 in relation to the then disturbed condition of Lower Canada. At the outset of this speech, he took up the position that all colonies were to be regarded as children of the mother country. The most noteworthy passage in this speech was Mr. Gladstone's statement that he did not think the separation of the colonies from the mother country was at all times and under all circumstances to be regarded with apprehension. But no one could look at the condition of Lower Canada at the moment and not perceive that it was surrounded by difficulties which would make a separation from the mother country anything but advantageous to itself. On the following 22nd of December there was another debate on the affairs of Canada, in the course of which Mr Gladstone acknowledged that he was not terrified at the prospect of separation. He did not think that the prosperity of England was dependent upon her connection with Canada. He was aware that there was an interchange of good offices and commercial advantages, but if anyone were to look at the balance of account, he would undoubtedly find that, in point of commercial advantage, England gave more than she received. But that was not the question. The question was whether, in a country where no practical oppression had been proved to exist, where person and property had been secure and would continue to be so, but for the machinations of popular agitators, where the law was duly administered, where the taxes were mild or none at all, they were, for the sake and on the ground of speculative and organic charges which promised no advantage to the colonies, and which must prove utterly destructive of the analogy and harmony which had existed between the mother country and the Canadians, to be terrified from maintaining that which they believed to be just on the first manifestation of the spirit of insurrection. Mr Gladstone again intervened in a debate on Canadian affairs which took place on the 23rd of January 1838 in connection with the Papineau revolt. After discussing in detail the alleged grievances of the insurgent colonists, and demonstrating, as he thought, the hollowness of their pretences, Mr Gladstone alluded to a statement that was calculated to create an impression favourable to the justice of the rebel cause, viz., that the United States were prosperous and flourishing as an independent community, while the energies of Canada were crippled, her commerce fettered, and the development of her resources retarded by her connection with Great Britain. They were told of the rapid progress of the American colonies of Britain when emancipated from her sway, as compared with the slow rate of their advances before. He, indeed, believed that there was no more remarkable example in history of speedy advancement in all that constituted the greatness of a nation than was furnished by the career of the American colonies of Great Britain, now forming the United States. As one remarkable instance of their prosperity, he might mention that the duties collected at Philadelphia advanced in 50 years from £25,000 to £500,000. But the foundations of the power and grandeur to which these colonies had attained were laid by the fostering care of Great Britain during the term of her dominion, and it was under British protection that their infant resources had been allowed to expand. The benefits which they had received from the rule of the parent state were thus described by Edmund Burke in his celebrated speech on American taxation. Quote, "Their monopolist happened to be one of the richest men in the world. By his immense capital, primarily employed not for their benefit, but his own, they were enabled to proceed with their fisheries, their agriculture, their shipbuilding, and their trade too, within the limits, in such a manner as got far the start of the slow, languid operations of unassisted nature. This capital was a hotbed to them. Nothing in the history of mankind is like their progress. For my part, I never cast an eye on their flourishing commerce and their cultivated and commodious life, but they seem to me rather ancient nations grown to perfection through a long series of fortunate events and a train of successful industry, accumulating wealth in many centuries, than the colonies of yesterday, than a set of miserable outcasts a few years ago, not so much sent as thrown out on the bleak and barren shore of a desolate wilderness, 3,000 miles from all civilised intercourse." End quote. Surely it stood to reason, Mr Gladstone proceeded, that in the infancy of a country it was far better that it should be connected with an old nation where capital existed in abundance, where the habits of men had been matured by the influence of long-established civilisation, and the resources of social life had been fully called into action, than that it should be left to itself to struggle unaided with the difficulties inseparable from any early stage of society. Such had been the case of Canada, and what was the real rate of her progress, which had been represented as so slow? If compared with the United States, its advance in prosperity was found to be even more rapid. In 1775, the population of Canada was but 60,000. It now amounted to 600,000, having multiplied tenfold since that year. At the commencement of the American War, the population of the United States was 2,500,000, and it now amounted to 15 million, having increased sixfold. How did these facts agree with the statements of the advocates of the insurgents who attempted to persuade the world that Canada had made no progress and had derived no benefits from its connection with the mother country? On the 10th of July 1838, Mr Gladstone rose to call attention to a petition he had presented from the inhabitants of Albany in the Cape Colony. Albany had been founded as a frontier post for the protection of the colony against the predatory incursions of the Kaffir tribes. The tract of country inhabited by these advanced colonists and received additions from time to time, and was denominated the ceded territory. It was peopled by British subjects of an honest and industrious character, who had conveyed thither their skill and capital during the administration of Lord Charles Somerset, and had remained there on the faith of receiving protection and support from the British Government. The colonists complained that faith had not been kept with them, and made various representations of the losses they had sustained for being in immediate contact with a barbarous enemy. These representations had been neglected by the Home Government, and the interests of the colonists had been sacrificed, so much so that ceded territory had been entirely given up to the Kaffirs, who now mingled with the farmers to the great prejudice and injury of the quiet and peaceable subjects of Great Britain. Feuds and contests were of frequent occurrence, sometimes attended by bloodshed and consequences of the most lamentable character. The feeling of insecurity thus generated amongst the colonists caused many of them, and particularly the Dutch Boers, to emigrate. The resources of the colony were thus left without employment, and a great part of the land remained uncultivated. Agricultural produce had greatly risen in price, and in the case of the great staple of corn and meal, to the extent of 300%. Fatal collisions with the natives were of constant occurrence. The Dutch Boers, disheartened by their misfortunes, had withdrawn from the colony into the desert, and placed themselves beyond the pale of society. Such was the precarious and unsafe position of the eastern portion of the South African territories of Great Britain, the evils attending which it was the bounden duty of Parliament to remove. Mr Gladstone therefore concluded by moving an address to Her Majesty, praying for the appointment of a commission of inquiry to investigate on the spot the past and present state of the relations of the colonists in the eastern part of the Cape of Good Hope with the Kaffir tribes, together with the best means of preventing a recurrence of the recent emigration of the population beyond the frontier. Sir George Grey, on behalf of the Government, opposed the motion on the ground that an adequate inquiry had already been instituted and steps taken to tranquillise the country. The troubles referred to had been largely due to the aggression of British subjects upon the Aboriginal inhabitants, and their endeavours to extend their territory for selfish and interested purposes. The pretext for these enlargements of territory from year to year had been the presumed necessity of increasing the security and safety of the colonists by placing an intermediate territory between them and the Kaffir tribes. The result was aggression on the part of the colonists, often causeless and unprovoked, and on the part of the Aborigines, eruption and massacre. Bloodshed had followed this attempt at acquiring that to which the aggressors had no right, but measures had been taken by the colonial government to put a stop to such sanguinary conflicts. On a division, Mr Gladstone's motion was defeated by a majority of 9. One of the most important speeches of Mr Gladstone on the colonial policy in general and Canadian affairs in particular was delivered in the House of Commons on the 29th of May 1840. He declared that the problem of relations between the North American provinces and the mother country was one of the most difficult and delicate ever submitted to any legislature, because the question they would have to determine in 1,000 various forms, and which would continually recur upon them, was this: in what manner and how long should they maintain a connection between societies which, though still politically one, were yet not socially one, but of which the original elements differed in many most important particulars? No one could look at the colonial laws respecting succession and the distribution of property, the habits and employments of the colonists, their feelings with regard to aristocracy, and the principles entertained respecting national religion throughout the North American provinces, and fail to see that there were great differences, original and inherent, in the elements out of which society was composed. These differences must render exceedingly difficult the regulation and maintenance of the union between a country essentially aristocratic in its feelings and principles, as he believed England to be, and countries in which some of the elements of society certainly seemed to tend towards democracy as their final consummation and development. It seemed to him that the maintenance of the connection between the mother country and the colonies should be regarded rather as a matter of duty than one of advantage. He could understand much better the doctrine that there was a duty incumbent on Great Britain with respect to the colonies, than the doctrine of those who said that, upon the mere balance of advantages, or as a case of political necessity, the connection should be maintained. So long as they retained the colonies as receptacles for their surplus population, they remained under a strict obligation to provide for those who left their shores at least what semblance they could of British institutions, and a home as nearly as might be like that which the emigrants had left, and to which the emigrants, when they became colonists, continued to retain a fond attachment. Upon that ground, he would always be glad to see the Imperial Parliament inclined to make large sacrifices for the purpose of maintaining the colonies. as long as the union with the mother country was approved of by the people of those colonies. But he conceived that nothing could be more ridiculous, nothing could be more mischievous, than to suppose that Great Britain had anything to gain by maintaining that union in opposition to the deliberate and permanent conviction of the people of the colonies themselves. Therefore, he thought it should be a cardinal principle of imperial policy to regard the union between Great Britain and Canada as dependent upon the free will of both parties. He also thought it of great importance that it should become thoroughly known and understood by the loyal people of British North America that the mother country looked to them as fellow labourers in the work of maintaining the present connection, that they must not leave Parliament in the position of a mere imperial authority, imposing by force the yoke of British connection on a reluctant population, but that they must be active and cordial co-operators, understanding that it was their part to contribute at least as much to the perpetuation of the Union as the Imperial Parliament could do on its part. It would be a great problem for the statesmanship of the future, when those growing societies would have attained such a degree of maturity as to be truly fit for self-government, to fix upon the period when the connection with the parent state should be severed. Meanwhile, preserving a temperate and conciliatory policy, with united action in Parliament, establishing in particular a liberal system of government, making non-interference the rule and interference the exception, they should maintain at the same time with a firm hand the supremacy of the British legislature and its right to assert that supremacy, recognising the necessity of having an executive unity throughout all portions of the empire, and consequently repudiating, as one of the shallowest of all possible delusions, the doctrine of responsible government as connected with the perpetuation of the Union. On the 27th of April 1841, Mr Gladstone took a prominent part in the inauguration of the Colonial Bishoprics Fund, at a numerously attended meeting convened by the Archbishop of Canterbury in Willis's Rooms. To Mr Gladstone, who spoke immediately after Archdeacon Manning, the destined cardinal of the future, was entrusted the resolution, that a fund be raised towards providing for the endowment of bishoprics in such of the foreign possessions of Great Britain as shall be determined upon by the Archbishops and Bishops of the United Church of England and Ireland. The proceedings of the day, he said, clearly proved that the members of the Church of England were prepared and ready to move forward under the united guidance of their rulers with heart wishes and prosperity in the undertaking on which they embarked. It might be regarded by some as a principle that the increase of the colonies added to the wealth of the colonists, and that out of that increased wealth they were bound to provide for their own spiritual necessities, but that was a fallacy which could not be too widely contradicted. The point to be taken into consideration was this: persons went to a new colony having everything to gain, and it was a matter of years ere those who had emigrated were placed by their exertions in a position to bear any expenses beyond those which the absolute necessities of their families demanded. It was to provide for this intermediate period between their first settlement and the day when they reached a condition of comparative affluence which would enable them to contribute to the support of the Church that the object of the present movement was directed. He would ask what was to become of their fellow countrymen whilst in that intermediate state, if something were not done for them. If the meeting desired to provide for the spiritual welfare of those of their fellow countrymen who, from circumstances, were induced or compelled to resort to a colony, let all present come forward and aid the undertaking, which was now presented to their support. Mr Gladstone emphasised the pecuniary advantages which Great Britain had derived from her colonies, and strongly urged that people at home were bound, out of their abundance, to do something to supply the spiritual wants of their countrymen beyond the seas, who had contributed so largely to the temporal benefits of the old country. At the close of the meeting, a subscription list amounting to £23,000 was read. It included £2,000 from Her Majesty, the Queen Dowager, £10,000 from the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, £5,000 from the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, and £1,000 from John Gladstone and Sons. After the lapse of 50 years, during the greater part of which period he held the office of Treasurer, Mr Gladstone was happily spared to join in the celebration of the Jubilee of the Colonial Bishoprics Fund at another crowded meeting in St James Hall on the afternoon of the 19th of June 1891. He moved the first resolution, recognising the remarkable success which had attended the extension of the episcopate in the colonies of the Empire and the missions of the Anglican Church throughout the world, At the outset of a very striking and eloquent speech, he referred to the likelihood that he was the only person present that day who was also present at the inaugural meeting of the fund in April 1841. He certainly thought that he was the only man, he would not say the only man living, but the only person living and also available for the occasion, who took part in the proceedings of that memorable meeting. This was a delicate allusion to Cardinal Manning, who had also survived the semi-century, but whose secession from the Church of England in the interim had effectually disqualified him from standing by the side of Mr Gladstone at the Jubilee meeting, as he had done at the inaugural gathering in Willis's Rooms. Nevertheless, Mr Gladstone embraced the opportunity to pay a glowing tribute to the power and influence which the Archdeacon Manning of that early period had exercised over the minds and hearts of the assembled churchmen in Willis's Rooms. He described Archdeacon Manning's speech on that occasion as sending a thrill of exultation through the whole assembly. Delivered as it was by a man of eminence, of known devotion to his work in his own good sense, and one whose whole mind and heart were given to the service of the Church of England. In a most striking and powerful speech, Archdeacon Manning delineated the condition of the English Church in the colonial empire of England. He pointed out upon how vast, how gigantic a scale Englishmen were occupying the waste places of the earth, and then he pointed to the scanty evidence which had been given of any care evinced by the Church of England for the propagation of the gospel in those vast countries. He contrasted the meagreness and feebleness of their spiritual efforts with the wonderful, undying, untiring energies of the commercial powers and the spirit of emigration. He said the Church of England had now to make her choice between the temporal and the spiritual. She had to determine whether she would be the beast of burden or whether she would be the evangelist of the world. That was a noble appeal and a noble challenge. The force of it was felt. It was taken up and duly answered, and Mr Gladstone added a hope that it would be answered again. If there were grounds for answering it then, when everything was in hope and expectation, much more were the grounds for enlisting in the same service now, when they had before them results which were not only satisfactory, but in their scale and nature wonderful. He was there that day as a historical landmark. The 50 years which had elapsed since the meeting held under the auspices of Archbishop Howley and Bishop Blomfield had produced effects of the deepest interest, some of them calamitous, others happy and blessed, in their consequences to the Church of England and to the general cause of religion. In 1841, the colonial bishoprics were 10 in number. In 1891, they numbered 82. He would venture to say that if the most sanguine man among those who attended the meeting of April 1841 had been asked to carry his glance forward 50 years into futurity and form an estimate of what might, on reasonable grounds, be then achieved, he would not have thought of basing his calculation upon any result even nearly, even remotely approaching that which, by the blessing of God, had been actually attained. The Church at home had experienced within those 50 years an immense elevation, and no small part of that elevation was due to the heroic enthusiasm which attended the first efforts at the foundation of the colonial episcopate. Names such as those of Bishop Selwyn, Bishop Patterson, Bishop Mackenzie, Bishop Armstrong and Bishop Field were names than which none brighter were to be found in the annals of the Church of England or of the Church of Christ at large. Mr Gladstone then proceeded to illustrate in detail one of the great lessons which he conceived to be taught by the event of the day, and that was the vast resources unfolded in the principles of voluntary action within the Christian Church. Mr Gladstone, addressing the House of Commons on the 22nd of March 1850 on the Australian Colonies Government Bill and arguing in favour of the creation of an elective upper house in New South Wales instead of a chamber of Crown nominees, said what in his heart he desired to see was the closest possible imitation in our colonies of our own institutions at home. That was the principle which he had at heart. But they could only effect that object through the medium of the inclination of the colonists. To attempt to create a Crown influence, a British influence, to rally a British party, and to make attachment to Britain a watchword in political strife, instead of being, as it ought to be, the common quality of all Her Majesty's subjects in the colonies and at home, then let them attempt to do this, and their policy would recoil upon themselves, and the consequence would be that the national movement of the popular mind in colonial communities would be allied to something of distaste for the introduction or the continuance of British institutions altogether. In the course of the same speech, Mr Gladstone avowedly contemplated the eventual separation of the colonies from the mother country and their erection into independent states. The school of political thought which identified itself with this theory, and which came to be colloquially known as the Manchester School, was at that time an active and influential force in English public life, but it has been practically extinguished by the rapid rise and remarkable development of the imperialistic ideal and the cementing principle of national unity during the past 25 years. Mr Gladstone asked the House of Commons to remember the lessons taught by the American Revolution. They should look to the time which might arise when the colonies would assert, he hoped with every regard and affection to the mother country, that they were then suited by Providence for the management of their own affairs. Difficulties might attend the crisis, and modern history did not furnish them with instances of a mother country allowing her colonies to declare themselves independent. He was not very sanguine for the future, but when these new states came to be launched into the world, it was of the greatest importance that they should have amongst themselves the elements of good institutions. In the United States, foolish and wicked as in other respects the conduct of this country might have been, England founded good institutions, and the people were now rewarded with the results. Mr Gladstone on this occasion was one of a minority of 147 that voted against the principle of nomineeism. At an earlier stage of the discussion on this bill, Mr Gladstone said he did not like the idea of gathering together a fixed body of gentlemen who were to be placed in the face of the elected members, not distinguished persons, placed there because they were the most distinguished characters in the colony, or who had received nomination as the reward of efficient public service. There was none of the grace or dignity attaching to their position which attached to the appointments to the House of Lords, where they had the most eminent men of their professions, great warriors, and those who had distinguished themselves in their various lines of life. On the contrary, they were put there by the influence of the Crown to check and control the actions of the elected members of the popular assembly. The appointment of these men involved a fundamental and a vital error. It proceeded from the supposition that the Crown had something to defend, which the popular assembly was likely to attack. It proceeded upon the supposition that the Crown had a set of interests in the colony opposed to those of the colonists, which tended to the creation of a sect or party in the colony. He did not deny that the gentlemen so nominated were sincerely loyal, but in his opinion it was most dangerous to do anything that might tend to create a feeling of sect or party in the colony. They should endeavour to make the whole colony one British party. The best course to pursue in order to obtain that desirable end would be to leave the colonists to themselves, leave them to the management of their own affairs, show nothing like a feeling of jealousy or distrust of them, nor endeavour to press upon them institutions which appeared to show that this country had separate interests and separate objects in view, for which it was thought necessary to appoint special means of defence. On the third reading of the bill, Mr Gladstone made a lengthy speech, in the course of which he pronounced strongly against the retention of the imperial veto on colonial legislation. This right of veto still exists in theory, and governors are instructed to reserve for the Queen's pleasure any colonial legislation that seems to them to be in direct antagonism to imperial interests and imperial precedents, but it has practically fallen into desuetude during recent years, so far as the great self-serving colonies are concerned. At the time Mr Gladstone spoke, it was in full strength and in general operation. He said that up to a recent period he had been deluded with the idea of the utility of the veto, but subsequent reflection had satisfied him that it ought not to be retained. It was the reason why they had at present the whole responsibility of the internal government of the colonies, and were burdened with the whole extravagant expenditure which flowed from that responsibility, an expenditure which would never be diminished until more rational ideas were entertained of freeing themselves from responsibility in colonial affairs, and he feared it would be long before rational ideas were adopted on this head if they allowed the present opportunity to pass of giving their fellow subjects, who were admitted to be quite prepared for the reception of representative institutions, the right of managing their own local affairs. What was the reason for maintaining the imperial veto on the laws of the colonies? Had it the advantage of securing a uniform system of law throughout the empire? No such thing, because laws had been passed in several British colonies which were in many cases at variance with British law. But if it did not secure uniformity, what did it do? It made law for a considerable period uncertain, thus detracting from the authority of the colonial legislatures, because often a period elapsed of from 12 to 18 months, and even of 2 years, between the passing of a law and the obtaining of the sanction of the Crown. Until that sanction was obtained, no man could tell whether it was law or not. Surely that was an evil of a very serious kind. Further, it had the effect of lowering the colonial tone, for it was adverse to the cherishing habits of freedom and self-dependence. There were in all colonies many citizens, the most valuable often for wealth and intelligence, who were at all times too ready to withdraw from public affairs, and that was a tendency which the measure before the House would foster and encourage, because those individuals who were fond of their personal ease would abstain from interfering in the management of colonial affairs when they knew that the imperial authorities would revise the proceedings of their local legislature, and they therefore trusted to the imperial parliament to prevent any flagrant measure from passing. The rights of freemen could never be separated from the responsibilities of freemen, and the rights of freemen could never be taken away without taking their responsibilities also. They would never have had the masculine tone in the American colonies which actually grew up there if this system of legislation had prevailed in the 17th century. Let them give the colony those benefits in reality which they professed to give, and let the colonists take the responsibility of framing the details of their own laws. Mr Gladstone's matured opinions in later life are not unfrequently in sharp contrast to the recorded sentiments of his earlier parliamentary period. His ideas on colonial independence underwent a complete transformation, as evinced in the following extract from a speech delivered at Leeds on the 8th of October 1881. Quote, "But, gentlemen, while I accord to our political opponents the full credit of a conscientious desire to maintain the glory of this empire, I will say that if there is to be a controversy upon the subject, if we are called to descend into the arena and to argue the matter here or elsewhere, I say it is Liberal and not Conservative policy which has made England respected and England strong. Why, gentlemen, if the old Tory policy of governing the colonies in Downing Street had been maintained, where would those colonies now have been? They would have been, by this time, groups of independent states. But Liberal policy freely granted to the colonists, in spite of Tory censure, the very same rights we claim for ourselves in the management of our affairs, and the consequence is that the inhabitants of those colonies are closely and cordially attached to the name and the throne of this country, and that perhaps, if a day of difficulty and danger should arise, which God forbid, from their affection we may obtain assistance and advantage that compulsion would never have wrung from them. And many find that all portions of the British Empire have one common heart, beating with one common pulsation, and equally devoted to the honour and interests of their common country." End quote. At the present time, it would be considered strange, incongruous, and possibly unconstitutional if a British colony avowedly had a paid political agent sitting in the House of Commons and representing its interests. But during the 4th and 5th decades of the century, the fact of the Honourable Sir Francis Scott, member for Berwickshire, acting in that capacity for New South Wales, does not seem to have excited any particular comment or surprise. On the 16th of April 1849, Mr Scott initiated a long debate on colonial administration by moving, quote, "that a select committee be appointed to inquire into the political and financial relations between Great Britain and her dependencies, with a view to reduce the charges on the British Treasury and to enlarge the functions of the colonial legislatures." End quote. In the course of his opening speech, Mr Scott made an incidental reference to Mr Gladstone's North Australian colony. A great subject of grievance, he said, and a great evil of their present colonial system was the constantly changing policy in Downing Street. During the previous 4 years, there had been 4 new secretaries and 4 fresh under-secretaries in the Colonial Office. Latterly, they had seen still greater changes in the office. The colonies not only changed their chief ruler every year or 18 months, but that master changed his own mind every 6 weeks, and the orders sent to the colonies were revoked by himself before they could come into operation. For instance, the dispatch affecting the social condition of Canada was sent out and revoked within a month. The constitution for New Zealand was sent out and revoked within a year. He would not further allude to the settlement established in North Australia, beyond observing that the Imperial Treasury had been saddled with £15,000 for that vagary. Transportation to Van Diemen's Land was adopted, then abandoned, then resumed, again abandoned, and since resumed in an altered form. A constitution which proved a misfit was sent out to New South Wales, and was now reported to have only been a sample, a pattern not meant for wear, and only sent out as a joke. He might add another of the same sort which was sent out to the Cape, and which was equally as bad a fit and as of little comfort to the intended wearer. He remembered hearing of Lord Grey sending shoes to the negroes and razors to men who had no beards, but this was worse, and such cup and ball practice, such battledore and shuttlecock play, was but poor fun for the unfortunate colonies. Mr. Hawes, the Under Secretary for the Colonies, made an elaborate speech in reply to Mr. Scott, concluding by asking the question, did they mean to surrender any portion of their colonial empire? If not, then they must pay the price of maintaining that empire. If they had colonies scattered over the globe, with their merchants and great mercantile interests in them, it was absolutely necessary to protect them. It was necessary that they should maintain the police of the seas. If they attempted materially to reduce their naval force, they would find their trade exposed to danger, and instead of being, as at present, carried on with perfect security and at a minimum of risk to all parts of the globe, the risk would be appreciably increased. In a word, if they would have a colonial empire, they must protect it. If they were prepared to say that the colonies must henceforth protect themselves, then, he would ask, what remained to attach these colonies to the mother country? He believed that the colonial empire had conferred great benefits upon the mother country, and he never wished to see that empire impaired. The colonists were their fellow subjects, united to them by ties of blood and affection. They shared a noble inheritance of which both were equally proud, and he hoped the day would never come when, from mere mercenary considerations, the Imperial Parliament would consent to weaken and diminish that empire which their forefathers had won and bequeathed to them, to be maintained with honour, justice, and liberality for the mutual benefit of the mother country and the colonies. Mr. Gladstone was the next speaker. He agreed with Mr. Hawes that no good would arise from granting a committee to inquire into a subject so extensive and complicated. As one who desired to see the attention of the home country brought to bear with an increasing degree of interest on colonial subjects, he was unwilling to assent to a description of inquiry which would not lead to any searching investigation or any practical result. He also agreed with Mr. Hawes that much of the unpopularity which had come upon the Colonial Department attached to it not on account of any views or principles or notions of its own which it had carried into execution, but on account of it having been an organ of Parliament and of the general views of the country, and but partially enlightened on colonial policy. He furthermore agreed with Mr. Hawes that no consideration of money ought to induce the House to sever the connection subsisting between any one of the colonies and the mother country. But there was a still more important consideration than that of money. It was how to give the greatest and most effective development to their colonial institutions. He thoroughly believed that a sound colonial policy had no tendency to separate the colonies from the mother country. Yet he did not think that the expenditure of large sums of money from the imperial treasury tended to strengthen or perpetuate the connection, and he did not hesitate to say that it was a mistake to propose the maintenance of the connection as one and the sole end which ought to be kept in view. The work and function which Providence had assigned to Great Britain in laying the foundation of mighty states in different quarters of the world was what ought to be kept steadily in view. Those infant communities ought to be cherished and fostered on principles which were sound and pure, on the principle of self-government, and if they did that, he was convinced that the political connection would subsist as long as it was good for either that it should subsist, and when it ceased, he hoped that the connection, instead of being severed in the midst of bloodshed, as was the case with the United States, would cease by reason of natural and acknowledged growth of those communities into states perfectly fitted for self-government and independence, and that after the termination of the political connection, a community of feeling would still subsist in a similarity of laws and institutions, and in a close union of affection. This would be infinitely more valuable than any political connection with England. Mr. Gladstone then proceeded to enter a resolute protest against a doctrine enunciated by Mr. Hawes that the Imperial Parliament had no right to act upon any question which the legislature of a self-governing colony was engaged in discussing. He held that freedom was the principle on which their colonial policy ought to be founded, but at the same time that freedom should be confined to local affairs. Imperial questions it could not and ought not to touch. With respect to local questions, he would yield to no man that in the breadth with which he would assert that in the fair and free working of a representative constitution, local questions must be left to its sole and entire disposal. But in questions of imperial concern, he claimed for himself, and every member of the Imperial Parliament, the right to raise his voice, either in the way of objection, inquiry, or discussion of whatever kind, with regard to any colonial proceeding in which he might conceive the interests of the empire or the honour of the crown to be involved. Mr Gladstone admitted it was a matter of great difficulty to introduce responsible government into the colonies, but he would like to raise the question whether it was a true or a fallacious principle that it was necessary to elevate the colonies to a certain height before they were considered fit for free institutions. He understood Mr Hawes to lay down the doctrine that free institutions would be given to the colonies as soon as they were fit for them, and to assert that most of the colonies were not yet fit for self-government. Setting aside the military posts, the colonies where there was a dominant race, and the colonies which were dependent on the annual votes of the House of Commons, he could not understand why the other colonies, and especially the Anglo-Saxon colonies, should not be ready for the possession of free institutions, whether their population was large or small. He believed the principle of colonial self-government to possess an elastic force which, though small at present, would expand with the future necessities of empire. Had this principle been acted upon in the past, they would have escaped many of the difficulties by which they were environed. He held that they must disembarrass themselves of the fallacious notion that a colony was to be reared and fostered by a government in Downing Street, that a colony must be raised to the extent of a population of 40 or 50,000, like Newfoundland, before it was fit for free institutions. That was the point on which the old colonial policy differed from the new. In founding the New England colonies, the mother country did not have the benefit of experience, but before 20 or 30 years had passed, most of these colonies had local self-government. They had it in its entirety when their population was only a few thousands, in some instances only a few hundreds, struggling on bleak and wintry coasts with all the difficulties of nature, and with but a small hope of attaining that eminence which they had since attained. He did not say that the principle went to the same extent in all, but there were more than one in which even the office of governor was elective, and in which colonial laws took effect without being submitted to the home country. The main question was whether the colonies should be governed by and among themselves, or whether they should be governed by a power separated from them by mighty oceans, not identified with them in feeling or in interest, and not possessed of that minute knowledge which would enable it to stimulate their powers into action, and develop the growth of their social and civil institutions. Among the subsequent speakers were Mr Hume, the member for Montrose, who strongly supported the motion, and complained that the colonies were not made as advantageous to the mother country as they might be, in the direction of absorbing surplus population, and Mr T.C. Anstey, the first gentleman from Australasia to secure a seat in the House of Commons, who characterised the colonial office as a great public nuisance, a decided mischief, and the common enemy of the colonies. Sir William Molesworth, who declared that war, rebellion, recurrent distress, dissatisfaction, and extravagant expenditure had been the most striking consequences of their present colonial policy, and Colonel Blackall, afterwards the second Governor of Queensland, who advocated the concession of representative government to the colonies and urged that they should be treated as children of the mother country. On a division, Mr Scott's motion was defeated by a majority of 47. On the following 26th of June, there was a second full-dress debate on colonial policy, arising out of a motion by Sir William Molesworth that an humble address be presented to Her Majesty praying for the appointment of a commission of inquiry into the administration of the colonies. Sir William delivered a powerful, exhaustive and well-informed speech, occupying no less than 33 columns of Hansard, and Mr Hume, in seconding the motion, excused his brevity on the substantial and sufficient ground that, quote, the Honourable Baronet had completely exhausted the subject, end quote. Mr Hawes, the Under Secretary for the Colonies, opposed the motion as, quote, perfectly impracticable and illusory, end quote. Mr Gladstone supported it in a lengthy speech and voted with the minority in its favour. He agreed with Mr Hawes that if the object of the motion was to institute a minute inquiry into colonial administration and into the abuses or grievances of which the colonies might complain, the House would commit a grave error if it were to address Her Majesty on the subject. But if he understood the question aright, the object of Sir William Molesworth was not to fasten charges on those who administered the colonies either in England or elsewhere, but to come to some rule and principle as to the future administration of their colonial empire. It appeared to him that instead of resting satisfied with leaving the question in the hands of the government, they ought to consider whether they should not call in some other mode of inquiring into colonial matters in order to endeavour to perfect the principles and policy. He thought the time had arrived when such an inquiry ought to be instituted, and looking to the scope of the motion rather than to its particular wording, He must say he thought the time had arrived when they should make the attempt. The Colonial Department had the conduct of correspondence with countries situated in every corner of the globe, and from the frequent changes of ministry which took place under the British constitutional system, before a despatch was answered, a new ministry might be in office. Then there was the further difficulty with which the colonial minister had to contend in a greater degree than other departments, that in 9 cases out of 10 it was impossible for him to draw the attention of the Parliament to colonial questions. He said 9 out of 10 cases because in the 10th the attention of the Parliament was obtained, on account of party spirit, to certain colonial questions, but in that case the consideration of the question was embittered by party spirit. If there were the same facility for drawing the attention of the House to colonial business, which there was with reference to matters connected with the Home Department, then things would be different, and it was this consideration which had brought him to the conclusion that, upon the whole, it was his duty, although he knew how objectionable commissions generally were, to support the motion. He would show that there were cases in which the labours of such a commission might be of service. In the first place, it would be most useful that a body of well-selected gentlemen should consider what were the general rules that should be followed in the establishment of new colonies. As a case in point, there was the proposal to establish a new settlement in North Australia, and after £15,000 had been expended upon the enterprise, Earl Grey came into office, and, considering that it was not expedient to go on with this settlement, the project was abandoned in consequence. There should be some reform adopted for binding a decision when arrived at that would give Parliament a voice in the question. Another material point demanding consideration and inquiry was whether the system of military defence carried on in the colonies was not needlessly expensive. There was the case of the Cape of Good Hope and the Kaffir War, where £1.5 million of money was virtually spent, or the obligation to pay it contracted, before the Imperial Parliament had heard a word on the subject. He was sorry to hear the Under Secretary speak with so much disparagement of the former colonial system before the independence of the United States, for such was the spirit of freedom in the then British colonies in North America, and such the colonists' sense of competency, not only to govern but defend themselves, that they were not, as the Under Secretary said the colonists were now, perpetually besieging the Imperial Parliament with demands for more troops and ships of war, and with complaints when the troops and ships of war were withdrawn. But with them it was a question of jealousy to have to provide for the permanent maintenance of British troops within the colonies, because they held that they were able to protect themselves. The relation between the colonists and the Aborigines with respect to boundaries was another proper subject for examination by a commission. In this matter there had been instances of vacillation and change, of capricious change having no reference to reason but merely to accidental circumstances, which were most discreditable. Take the case of the Cape. Some years ago a coercive policy was enforced, and it was resolved to effect the repression of the Kaffir tribes with a strong hand. In 1835, philanthropy was at a high watermark, and the Colonial Office was obliged to give in to those who wished to go to the greatest length in favour of the Aborigines. The consequence was that the stringent system was given up, and a great portion of territory abandoned. What was now the case? For some years philanthropy had been at low watermark, and very short work had been made of the Kaffirs. The policy of territorial aggrandisement had been pursued to an extent exceeding all example, and they had not only undone all they did when they gave up the ceded territory, but they had made enormous additions to it. Upon the whole, he was satisfied that a carefully appointed commission would be a most material aid and assistance in the discharge of the duties of the government of the colonies. He hoped all parties had the same end in view. What they had to look at was the good alike of the mother country and her colonies. If they directed their minds steadily to the promotion of the good of the colonies and of the people of the home country in relation thereto, they need not fear for the permanence of the connection. On the contrary, he believed that would be the way to maintain the connection, and to maintain that which he believed to be even more important than the mere political connection, namely the love of the colonies for the home country and a desire to imitate the laws and institutions of the great country from which they sprang. Mr Labouchere, afterwards Lord Taunton, the uncle of the Mr Labouchere of today, and himself a colonial secretary of the early future, followed Mr Gladstone, and declined to support what was practically a vote of censure upon the whole colonial policy of the British Empire. Mr Adderley could see no reason for refusing the commission asked for in the motion. Lord John Russell wound up the debate, and expressed his surprise that a gentleman so conversant with parliamentary business as Mr Gladstone should entertain the utopian idea that, by selecting 5 persons from various quarters of the House, with one to superintend and arbitrate amongst them, some certain and infallible rule of wisdom in colonial matters would be obtained. The best thing the House could do with regard to colonial policy was to enlarge the freedom of the colonies and give them greater power for governing themselves. On a division, 89 voted for Sir William Molesworth's motion and 163 against it. That now familiar and flourishing organisation in Northumberland Avenue, the Royal Colonial Institute, represents the growth, expansion and legitimate development of a movement initiated by a few thoughtful and far-seeing colonists who met at Willis's Rooms on the 26th of June 1868 and resolved to found a colonial society. The inaugural dinner of the society was held at the same place on the 10th of March 1869. Mr Gladstone, then Prime Minister, was present and responded to the toast of Her Majesty's ministers. It was proposed by the chairman, Viscount Berry MP, who referred to Mr Gladstone as, quote, the man who, distinguished among all his compeers by his eloquence and by his talents, stands foremost in the councils of our beloved Queen, a man of whom we can all be proud as a citizen of our common country, distant though some portions of that country may be, and though seas may roll between the place in which we are now assembled and the native homes of some who sit around me. Yet we all claim with Mr Gladstone a common citizenship and a common allegiance to our Queen." End quote. In replying, Mr Gladstone recalled the fact that 34 years had passed since he first became a member of the staff of the Colonial Department, and 23 since he last held office in that department. He adverted to those dates not for the sake of gratifying an antiquarian curiosity, but for a different and worthier purpose. Looking back over those years, no one could fail to be struck with the great change for the better which had, in the interval, passed over the spirit of their colonial policy. In the days when he was accustomed to wear out with his footsteps the stairs of the Colonial Office, that office was haunted by a disembodied spirit which received a painful distinction under the title of Mr Mother Country, and while that description conveyed no inaccurate idea of the narrow traditions that then hung about the conceptions of English statesmen on the other side of the water in every British colony, there was a party which he rejoiced to think had since been totally extinguished under the name of the British Party. He spoke in the hearing of those who remembered the circumstances and the struggles of those times, when many in England were taught to believe that upon the British Party, which invariably represented an insignificant minority, depended the whole hope of maintaining the connection between England and the colonies, and that if anything were done to offend the British Party, or to recognise the vast majority of the colonial community as having a claim upon the sympathies and actions of their countrymen at home, such a policy was certain to be fatal to the colonial empire. That was a state of things so strange to recall, it now seemed like bringing back from the grave the spirits of the dead, so wholly was it without a representative in the condition of affairs that now existed. He rejoiced to see around that hospitable board the representatives of the entire British family. He rejoiced that a great branch, possibly the greatest branch, of that family was represented among them that evening by one who, though numerically but an individual, yet had in him a heart which beat warmly with the sympathies that belonged to the origin from which he derived his name and the traditions of his country, and who, in a manner inferior to none that had gone before him, was qualified to represent that spirit of brotherhood which ought to unite throughout the world the whole British race. This was a reference to Mr Reverdy Johnson, the then United States Minister in London, whose speech preceded Mr Gladstone's. In conclusion, Mr Gladstone said there was no degree of latitude or of longitude on the surface of the globe which had not offered its contribution to the gathering of that evening, and he rejoiced that the time had come when it was fully recognised that, while the affection between England and her colonies grew stronger and stronger, the nature of the relation between them was also better and better understood, a relation undoubtedly associated with great imperial interests, but founded upon something higher and deeper than interest, founded upon honour and affection, and having above all for its basis the essential principle of freedom, a departure from which, in the policy which governed the conduct of England towards her colonies, would at once destroy both the charm and the value of the connection which subsisted between them. He was glad to think that the time had come when those facilities of communication, which now brought into neighbourhood the remotest quarters of the globe, enabled colonists in England to organise a society which would have the hope of quickening by constant personal intercourse and sympathies the relationship which ought to unite all the British colonies. Other clubs had in view the maintenance of a relation between friends and classes. The Colonial Society contemplated a nobler object, that of handing down from generation to generation the great and noble tradition of the unity of the British race. A banquet was held on the 15th of November 1872 under the auspices of the Royal Colonial Institute to celebrate the completion of telegraphic communication between England and Australia. The Earl of Kimberley, then Secretary of State for the Colonies, presided and read the following letter from Mr. Gladstone. Quote, 10 Downing Street, Whitehall, November 13. My dear Kimberley, I write you a line to say how sincerely sorry I am that I am unable to attend the dinner to celebrate the opening of telegraphic communication with Australia. I should have been very glad had it been possible to be present on this occasion, when the strong attachment which now binds, as it has ever bound, the Australian colonies to the mother country is cemented by the completion of so important and so useful a work. Well remembering the time when I had the honour of holding the office which you now so worthily fill, and when I was, as I could hardly fail to be, specially interested in the Australian colonies, I need hardly say how agreeable it would have been to me to meet some of those whose names are still fresh in my memory. Believe me, sincerely yours, W. E. Gladstone. Reader's note, letter ends. Taking as his text the words of Lord Beaconsfield on returning to London from the Berlin Conference in July 1878, quote, Gentlemen, we bring you peace and peace with honour, end quote, Mr. Gladstone contributed to the 19th Century of the following September a lengthy article on, quote, England's mission, end quote, in which he ventilated his more matured views on the subject of colonial expansion. The sentiment of empire, he wrote, may be called innate in every Briton. If there are exceptions, they are like those of men born blind or lame among us. It is part of our patrimony, born with our birth, dying only with our death, incorporating itself into the first elements of our knowledge and interwoven with all our habits of mental action upon public affairs. It is a portion of our national stock, which has never been deficient, but which has more than once run to rank excess, and brought us to mischief accordingly, mischief that for a time we have weakly thought was ruin. In its normal action, it made for us the American colonies, the grandest monument ever erected by a people of modern times, and second only to the Greek colonisation in the whole history of the world. In its domineering excess, always under the name of British interests and British honour, it lost them by obstinacy and pride. Lord Chatham, who forbade us to tax, Mr. Burke, who forbade us to legislate for them, would have saved them, but they had to argue for a limitation of English power, and to meet the reproach of the political wiseacres who first blustered on our greatness, and then, when they reaped as they had sown, whined over our calamities. Undoubtedly, the peace of 1782-83, with its adjuncts in exasperated feeling, was a terrible dismemberment. But England was England still, and one of the damning signs of the politics of the school of Lord Beaconsfield is their total blindness to the fact that the central strength of England lies in England. They are the materialists of politics. Their faith is in acres and in leagues, in sounding titles and long lists of territories. They forget that the entire future of the British Empire was reared and consolidated by the energies of a people which was, bracket, though is not now, end bracket, insignificant in numbers when compared with the leading states of the continent. Of all the opinions disparaging to England, there is not one which can lower her like that which teaches that the source of strength for this almost measureless body lies in its extremities and not in the heart, which has so long propelled the blood through all its regions, and in the brain, which has bound and binds them into one. In the sphere of personal life, most men are misled through the medium of the dominant faculty of their nature. It is round that dominant faculty that folly and flattery are wont to buzz. They play upon vainglory by exaggerating and commending what it does, and by piquing it on what it sees cause to forbear from doing. It is so with nations. For all of them, the supreme want really is to be warned against the indulgence of the dominant passion. The dominant passion of France was military glory. Twice in this century it has towered beyond what is allowed to man, and twice has paid the tremendous forfeit of opening to the foe the proudest capital in the world. The dominant passion of England is extended empire. It has heretofore been kept in check by the integrity and sagacity of her statesmen, who have not shrunk from teaching her the lessons of self-denial and self-restraint. But a new race has arisen, and the most essential or the noblest among all the duties of the government, the exercise of moral control over ambition and cupidity, has been left to the intermittent and feeble handling of those who do not govern. With the Liberal Party, the great duty and honour and charge of our transmarine colonial empire is to rear up free congenital communities. They receive a minority of our immigrants, of whom the larger number go to the United States, but in receiving this minority, they enlarge for our outgoing population the field of choice, and by keeping them within the Empire, diminish the shock and severance of change. It is felt at the same time that Great Britain has, against the merely material advantages of such possessions as British North America and the magnificent Australasian group, greatly enlarged her military responsibilities in time of war. Still, whatever be in these respects the just balance of the account, it is felt that the colonial relation involves far higher elements of consideration, that the founding of these free, growing and vigorous communities has been a specific part of the work providentially assigned to Britain. The day has gone by when she would dream of compelling them by force to remain in political connection with her, but on the other hand, she would never suffer them to be torn away from her, and would no more grudge the cost of defending them against such a consummation than the father of a family grudges the expense of the food necessary to maintain his children. Mr Gladstone concluded the colonial section of his essay on England's mission, with a modified echo of his early opinions on the eventual destiny of the colonies. With their opponents, he is referring to the opposition to Lord Beaconsfield's government, it is the welfare of these communities which forms the great object of interest and desire, and if the day should ever come when, in their own view, that welfare would be best promoted by their administrative emancipation, then, and only then, the liberal mind of England would at once say, let them flourish to the uttermost, and if their highest welfare requires their severance, we prefer their amicable independence to their constrained subordination. The substance of the relationship lies not in dispatches from Downing Street, but in the mutual affection and the moral and social sympathies which can only flourish between adult communities when they are on both sides free. End of chapter 17. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Chapter 18 of The Gladstone Colony, an unwritten chapter of Australian history by James Francis Hogan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. A couple of colonial lectures. Having regard to his surpassing qualifications as a speaker, the vast range of his reading, his personal magnetism and wonderful powers of exposition and illustration, it is somewhat surprising that Mr Gladstone should have figured so rarely in his long public life in the capacity of a lecturer. No doubt the explanation is that British statesmen of the first rank are more fettered by the unwritten laws of tradition and etiquette than American public men, who take to the lecturing platform like ducks to water. Still, Mr Gladstone has delivered avowed and advertised lectures in his time, although they have been but few and far between. While on a visit to HOGAN Castle, then in the occupation of his relative Sir Stephen Glynn, Mr Gladstone delivered a lecture in the boys' schoolroom of the village on the 12th of October 1855, taking as his subject the colonial policy of England. The address was given at the request of a number of working men constituting the committee of the Literary Institute of the village. Charges of sixpence and a shilling were made for admission, and there was a crowded attendance. The English artisan or labourer, said Mr Gladstone, in emigrating, looked to the interest of those over whom God had given him control. He saw in the far-off country a better prospect for his family, better remuneration for his own labour, more of the comforts of life within his reach, and he was thus willing to forego the pleasures of the present for the hopes of the future. Such were the men who were leaving the shores of England in such numbers each succeeding year. Many good, pious men advocated colonisation because it gave facilities and opportunities for conveying to the benighted and the ignorant a knowledge of the truths of the gospel. Such a motive as that every Christian mind must respect, but it was to be feared that few immigrants left the shores of England impelled by such a motive. The most general influence which had operated in leading thousands to the auriferous shores of Australia would be found in the love of gold, a love which has always existed, and which not infrequently led to bad as well as good results. There was something marvellous in this love of gold. Persons who could not be acted upon in any other way were often found most enthusiastic in the pursuit of the precious ore. The discovery of a gold mine excited the curiosity and the cupidity of thousands, while the discovery of an ironstone mine scarcely attracted attention at all, and yet the one was not more important than the other. An ironstone mine was as useful, and therefore, proportionately, as valuable. Without ironstone, gold would lose much of its worth, because, while gold was only used as a representative of value, ironstone was the value itself, and the value of each was relative to the other. Yet the discovery of ironstone did not tickle people's fancy or desire like gold. Before the discovery of America by Columbus, there was an idea floating in the minds of philosophers that on the other side of the Atlantic there must be a continent of corresponding weight, which acted as a counterpoise and kept the earth in equilibrium. The Spanish adventurers who went out and took possession of that new world found no gold mines, but they got what was infinitely better, a free soil, and room for active operations in commerce and trade. After describing, quote, the fallacies and fallacies that kept our colonies poor and dependent and made them a clog and a burden to England instead of a benefit and a blessing, end quote, Mr Gladstone enlarged on his favourite text of the wisdom of conceding to the colonies perfect freedom in all that appertained to their domestic concerns. Some, he said, had argued that if the colonies were allowed to govern themselves, levy and collect their own revenue, they might be tempted to tax articles which were required in the home country as food, and which were now received in English ports almost duty-free. The very selfishness of this idea made it ridiculous. As long as British merchants possessed the spirit of enterprise that had rendered them the glory of the country, they need be under no apprehension that the parent state would suffer, even though the colonists should levy taxes upon the articles of merchandise in which they dealt. The British merchant might always be trusted to find the cheapest and best markets, by using which his capital was alone made productive and the interests of his country subserved. The moral benefits of colonisation arose out of the influence which attached to the spread of the English language, English habits, and English tastes over different parts of the world. To have the signs of English families planting themselves in the colonies, rearing their offspring, and extending the area occupied by the sturdy Anglo-Saxon race was to increase the moral influence of Old England and maintain in a natural and legitimate manner the prestige of her name. Although much diversity of opinion existed amongst all classes of contemporary politicians in reference to the colonies, yet all were inclining towards a more liberal and enlightened policy, and the spirit of prejudice which distinguished the latter end of the last century had given place to views, opinions, and sympathies which augured well for the future. They might hope, therefore, that the experiences of the past would be of use in the present, and that the future policy of England in regard to the colonies would be candid, honest, and wise, for it was only by a liberal and enlightened course of treatment that the parent country could reap the full advantage and benefit of her great territorial dependencies. On Monday, the 12th of November 1855, Mr Gladstone delivered a second lecture on Our Colonies to the members of the Mechanics' Institute at Chester, and it was fully reported by the gentleman who is now Mr Justin McCarthy, MP, but who was then a young man on the staff of the Northern Daily Times. Mr McCarthy's report was revised by Mr Gladstone and published with his permission as a pamphlet of 21 pages. At the outset, Mr Gladstone declared that he scarcely knew how to select, from the vast redundance which the subject offered, the limited amount of material that must suffice for a single address. The little word colonies included in itself ample matter for the most interesting discussion, so vast that even the minor branches of it had given occasion for the most important and interesting treatises in their distinct and separate forms. If, for example, he named such a question as the discovery of gold in Australia, such a question as the laws which governed and regulated emigration, such a question as the history of negro slavery and the means through which it had been brought to an end, such a question as the treatment of the Aboriginal tribes inhabiting and bordering upon various British settlements, or, to name only one more, such a question as the great subject of the transportation of British criminals to distant British possessions, each one of these, apart from every other, was not only sufficient to occupy the utmost period which he could possibly ask that night from the indulgence of his hearers, but had been found sufficient to occupy nights upon nights, weeks upon weeks, and months upon months of the thoughts of the ablest writers and the discussions of both Houses of Parliament. Entering on what he designated as, quote, the rudest and very slightest sketch of a subject so vast in its range, end quote, Mr Gladstone proceeded to point out that the great subject of the colonies of the British Empire had now come to constitute a question of the most just and legitimate interest to every Englishman, and amply justified the zeal and favour that were testified by the crowded attendance of that evening. In the middle of the last century, the American colonial empire of England was, in simple and literal truth, the envy and admiration of the world. It was then thought that nothing could be seen for centuries upon centuries to compare with that empire. And yet the American population at the outbreak of the War of Independence amounted to only 2 millions of souls. What was the state of things now? Why, the single colony of Canada contained a population nearly equal to the whole of the 13 American colonies of that time. Such was the magnitude and importance to which the empire had attained. Again, there was scarcely any European language of note or importance which was not spoken in the colonies. The subjects of the Queen in Malta and the Ionian Islands spoke the beautiful languages of Italy and Greece. A considerable portion of the Canadians, the people of the populous island of Mauritius, the people of St. Lucia and other West Indian islands spoke the language of the great French nation. In British Guiana and at the Cape of Good Hope, Dutch was spoken. In the important colony of Trinidad, Spanish was the vernacular tongue, and thus the Queen of England, of an island which was once looked upon as a separated and remote extremity of the habitable globe, possessed an empire under which were arrayed not only barbarous tribes who spoke tongues almost innumerable, but communities who spoke the most cultivated, distinguished, and famous languages of highly civilised Europe. Turning to the question of emigration, Mr Gladstone said it was formerly a matter of remote knowledge and concern, and even 20 or 30 years ago it was regarded only as a means of getting rid of the offscourings of the population. But now it had become, on the contrary, a matter of close and domestic interest to many of the most intelligent, the best conditioned, and most respected families in the country. In the year 1815, the entire number of emigrants who left the shores of England was 2,000. In 15 years, from 1815 to 1830, the average immigration of England was 20,000. The average for the years between 1830 and 1844 rose from 20,000 to 80,000. During the next 10 years, it rose to 267,000. And in the year 1852, the sum total reached no less a number than 368,000 people. Over 1,000 persons thus quitting the shores of England every day to find a home in the British colonial empire. It would thus be seen that the increase in the quantity of the emigration was of a most remarkable character. The change in the quality was still more worthy of notice, because for a long time emigration was nothing but the resort of the most necessitous. Now, on the contrary, in a great many cases, many present that evening would be able to bear testimony to instances within their own domestic sphere or private knowledge. It was not the needy and the necessitous, but it was the most adventurous, the most enterprising, the most intelligent man, the most valuable member of society in the sphere in which he moved, who went to seek his fortune in those distant lands. Mr Gladstone then entered into a minute discussion of the questions: why was it desirable that England or any other country should possess colonies at all? And assuming that such possessions were desirable, in what manner should those colonies be founded and governed? The time was when these were treated as party questions, but he trusted and believed that that time had passed away, and the truths relating to this great subject were beginning to be generally acknowledged, and that the English people were thoroughly united as to the mode of fulfilling one of the highest functions which Providence seemed to have committed to their hands, namely, that of conducting the work of colonisation and peopling a great portion of the habitable globe. The vast colonisation of modern times, which took its course from eastward to westward across the Atlantic, must have been prompted by some powerful motive. What was that motive? It was the love of gold that drew forth from Italy, Spain, France, England and Portugal those men whose bold and adventurous spirit tracked the stormy Atlantic and founded successively, amidst dangers and difficulties indescribable, those colonies which had now grown into the great states of Northern and Southern America. They went to America in search of gold. They found no gold, but observe how, by the wise dispensations of Providence, the very delusions of mankind were made to serve their great interests. In North America there was no discovery of the precious metals worth naming, but there was a discovery of a great and powerful country, teeming with all the resources of nature, offering a home to mankind and the most extended field for the development of human energy and industry in every branch. Some had said, and more had thought, that colonies were to be founded for the sake of increasing and improving by their direct contributions the revenue of the mother country, and of this idea there were contemporary instances in the colonies of Spain, but also in some of the colonial possessions of Holland. But that had never been the view with which the work of British colonisation had been carried on. Others again had thought that it must be desirable to possess colonies because colonies constituted a large addition to the territory of the country. Undoubtedly, the possession of territory was valuable, provided a proper use was made of it. But it was not desirable for England or any other nation to possess an extent of territory without bounds and without reference to the power of turning it to account. Then again, people had a notion that for the reputation of the country it was desirable to possess colonies. He did not desire that the possession of colonies did contribute to the just reputation of England and add to its moral influence, power and grandeur. But if it was meant by this doctrine that it was desirable to have colonies in order to make a show in the world, with which there was no substance to correspond, that, they would all agree, was not a good reason for desiring an extension of a colonial empire. It could never be to the interest of England or any other country to be taken for more than it was worth. There was, again, a notion more vulgar than any of these, that it was desirable to possess colonies for the sake of the patronage they afforded to the home government. Many present were old enough to remember occasions when persons whom it was not convenient or decorous to provide for at home had received appointments in the colonies, but of such cases he hoped there would be no recurrence. An idea far more important and effective, to a far greater extent, was the theory that colonies ought to be maintained for the purpose of establishing an exclusive trade, the whole profit of which should be confined to and enjoyed by the mother country. That was, in fact, the basis of the modern colonial system of Europe. Now look at the effect of an idea of such a nature. When colonies were founded upon this principle, the home government acted as if the colony could only benefit one other country by its trade. It proceeded upon the false notion, which was once at the bottom of the commercial laws of England, and which was still at the bottom of the commercial laws of many other nations, the notion that there could be any other basis whatever for trade except the benefit of both parties concerned, the idea that any trade was possible where all the gains were at one side, the idea above all that whatever was gained by one was taken from the other. That was the great fallacy of the protective system, the system which prevailed still in many countries of Europe. The truth, on the contrary, with respect to trade, being that when one man gained, the other man must gain also. There was no possible mainspring of trade except the benefit of both parties engaged in carrying it on. Mr Gladstone repudiated any and all of those reasons for desiring the possession of colonies. Why then were colonies desirable? In his opinion, they were desirable both for the material and for the moral and social results which a wise system of colonisation was calculated to produce. As to the first, the effect of colonisation undoubtedly was to increase the trade and employment of the mother country. Take the case of the emigrant going across the Atlantic. Why did he go to America? Because he expected, and in general he was the best judge of his own interests, to get better wages across the Atlantic than he could get at home. If he went across the Atlantic to get better wages, he left in the labour market at home fewer persons than before, and consequently raised the rate of wages at home by carrying himself away from the competition with his fellows. By going to a colony and supplying it with labour, he likewise created a demand for capital there, and by that means created a trade between the colony and the mother country. The capital and labour thus employed in the colony raised and exported productions, for which commodities were wanted in return. Of those commodities, a very large proportion was usually sought from the parent country, for it was almost always the case that a colony was founded under circumstances where the country to which the settlers went produced the very commodities which were wanted in the country they had left. Therefore, so far as trade and the gain connected with trade were concerned, it was perfectly obvious that the foundation of a colony, where it was the natural and spontaneous result of the circumstances in which a country was placed, was simply a great enlargement of the material resources of that country. There could be no doubt that the possession of colonies like those of England, which were peopled by the spontaneous operation of natural causes, or, in other words, by the free judgment of the people, each man carrying his labour or his capital to the market where he thought he might get the best price for either, was eminently beneficial, not because it created a more profitable trade than other trades, but because it created a perfectly new trade, and a trade which would not otherwise have existed. The moral and social advantage of colonies was also a very great one. An increase of population was an increase of power, an increase of strength and stability to the state, because it multiplied the number of people living under good laws and belonging to a country to which it was an honour and an advantage to belong. That was the great moral benefit that attended the foundation of British colonies. Theirs was a country blessed with laws and a constitution that were eminently beneficial to mankind, and that, being so, what could be more desirable than that they should have the means of reproducing in different portions of the globe something as like as might be to the country which they honoured and revered. It was, he believed, in a work by Mr Roebuck that the expression was used that, quote, the object of colonisation is the creation of so many happy Englands, end quote. It was the reproduction of the image and likeness of England, the reproduction of a country in which liberty was reconciled with order, in which ancient institutions stood in harmony with popular freedom and a full recognition of popular rights, and in which religion and law had found one of their most favoured homes. And as it was the destiny of man to live in society under laws and institutions, it was desirable that he should live under good laws and institutions, and it was because Britons were convinced that their constitution was a blessing to them, and would be a blessing to their posterity, as it had been to their forefathers, that they were desirous of extending its influence, that it should not be confined within the narrow borders of one little island, but that, if it pleased Providence to create openings for them upon the broad fields of distant continents, they should avail themselves in reason and moderation of those openings to reproduce the copy of those laws and institutions, those habits and national characteristics which had made England so famous as she was. Mr Gladstone then proceeded to discuss the practical question how colonies could be founded and governed. He eulogised and described in detail the ancient Greek system of colonisation and the quote, true spirit of British freedom, end quote, in which the first American colonies were established and administered. Touching upon the American War of Independence, Mr Gladstone said that before England began the system of meddling and peddling in the affairs of her American colonies, the attachment of these colonies to the mother country was warm, strong and affectionate. But when the British colonists in America saw a disposition to deprive them of their time-honoured hereditary privileges, when they saw that Englishmen, so jealous of their own liberties at home, were disposed to stint and narrow the enjoyment of such liberties by their brethren who had crossed the Atlantic, a bitterness of sentiment sprang up, and the bitterness was not the fault of the Americans. It was the unhappy result of the errors of British policy and of the circumstances of the time. The unhappy consequence of this feeling, aggravated in the course of a long, bloody and obstinate struggle, was that at the time when American independence was acknowledged, the affections of the Americans towards their motherland had received a desperate blow. For a long time the name of Englishman was odious, and naturally odious, in America. The name of England was associated with oppression, and those among the Americans who were known to entertain a strong feeling of affection towards her were odious in the eyes of their fellow countrymen. That temporary estrangement of feeling, which was then almost total, and which even now, notwithstanding the healing influence of time, had necessarily left some traces behind, was part of the mighty price that England had paid for the error involved in a misconception of the right manner of governing her colonies, the error of attempting to levy taxes upon the people of America. Some people thought that that was not an error of the English people. Let there be no mistake on that head. If there was one thing in history more clear than another, it was that the English nation, at the beginning of the American War, was suited almost to a man in the prosecution of that war. All wars, almost without an exception, had been popular in England during the first year, or even during the second and third, but the American War was especially popular in its earlier stages. The military organisation was all on the side of England, but it was not the want of success in the field that defeated England in the American War. It was this, that though they most commonly beat America in the field, they were no nearer than before to the subjugation of the country. They possessed the ground where the camps had been pitched, but they possessed nothing else. The enemy was in the heart of every man, woman and child, and driving their soldiery out of the field did not establish the power of England in the hearts of a people who were fighting for their freedom. The case of the American War, considering how universally it was now admitted that a great error was committed in beginning and in continuing it, was one upon which Englishmen could look back with great advantage, for all generations and all times, as a most emphatic lesson of caution, circumspection and moderation. From 1783 to 1840, the idea was entertained that it was absolutely necessary that the local affairs of the colonies should be directed from a certain spot in the City of London. It was difficult to believe to what an extent this interference with the affairs of their fellow colonists was carried. In the first place, it was thought that they, in England, should retain in their own hands, and on no account give the colonists the disposal of the unoccupied lands of the colonies. Then it was thought that, in addition to the taxes raised by the colonists themselves to support the colonial government, there should be another set of revenues, called Crown revenues, to provide for the contingency that the people of the colony might be so ignorant and barbarous as to make no provision for the very first necessities of their own government. The next step was to keep standing armies in the colonies to discharge the functions of police, the consequence of which was enormous expense to the mother country and the greatest mischief to the discipline of the army, the troops being parcelled out here, there and everywhere in such small bodies that they lost the unity of action which an army acquired by being trained and disciplined in masses. Another mistake in the practice was that of requiring the people of the colonies to establish a civil list, a certain range of salaries for governors, judges, secretaries and other public officers. Did the Home Government suppose that the colonists themselves did not recognise the necessity of law and order? Another faulty rule was the establishment for each colony of a certain tariff of differential duties, the mother country thus dictating, by means of commercial laws, the price to be paid for commodities coming to the colonies from any quarter of the globe. The North American was thus compelled to pay an extra price for West Indian sugar, and he was compensated in turn by making the West Indian pay an additional price for North American wool, so that instead of the commercial interchange being a blessing or a benefit, it was made an interchange of evils and reciprocal inflictions. Lastly, it was the custom to exercise patronage in the colonies as far as could be safely ventured, and whenever there were people who were not quite presentable at home, whom the English would not quietly endure to see appointed to office in their own country, it was commonly thought they were quite good enough to hold office, often with a handsome salary, in some remote colony. The general effect of this system of governing the colonies from Downing Street decidedly tended to alienate the hearts of the colonists from the mother country. It led to a knot of people in each country combining together and calling themselves the British Party. They were always extremely loud in their professions of zeal in support of the executive, and they generally had one or more newspapers behind them. The rest of the community were deemed anti-British, and thus the name that ought to have been the dearest of all names to every colonist became the arbitrary distinction of a few, as opposed to the mass of the community. On the one side was the governor with a little body of official persons, and another little body of individuals picked out of the community. These were tugging one way, supported by the power of the British government, and on the other side was tugging the whole mass of the colonial population. Happily, all that was now changed. The principle was now fully recognised that the local affairs of free colonies should be fully managed by the colonists themselves, and in this connection Mr Gladstone said he wished to discharge a debt of justice. There were some men in England who had undoubtedly proceeded far in advance of their fellow legislators with regard to colonial affairs. He mentioned them because, for the most part, they were men with whose political opinions it was his fate, commonly, or very frequently, to differ. Moreover, he thought that as the time of the greatest colonial freedom, the reign of Charles II, was eminently a Tory time, it was but fair and in the spirit of equal justice to render their due to men of a quite different political connection, some of the radical members of the British Parliament. Mr Hume, Mr Roebuck, and a gentleman whose name had just been added to the list of the departed, Sir William Molesworth, were all of them great benefactors to their country by telling the truth upon the right method of colonial government at a time when the truth was exceedingly unpopular. Of Sir William Molesworth he would say that he had the greatest satisfaction in owning the benefit and instruction which, during many years, he had derived from personal communication with that distinguished man on colonial questions, and in acknowledging how much he had learned from the speeches which Sir William had delivered from time to time on subjects of colonial policy in the House of Commons. In concluding his Chester address, Mr Gladstone said it was now coming to be understood that the affairs of the colonies were best transacted by the colonists themselves, as the affairs of England were best transacted by Englishmen. Upon this understanding they would act more and more, and with still increasing advantage. By all means let English institutions be founded in the colonies to the utmost extent to which their circumstances were adapted. The main question was, who was to be the judge of that extension? They at home were not good judges whether laws useful and convenient to England ought to prevail in the colonies or not. The colonists themselves were the best judges of that. Experience had proved that in order to strengthen the connection between the colonies and the mother country, and secure the adoption of British institutions in communities beyond the seas, the hated name of force and coercion exercised by people at a distance over their rising fortunes should never be invoked. Let the colonies be governed upon the principle of freedom. Let them not feel any yoke upon their necks. Let them understand that their relations with the old land were relations of affection, and Englishmen would surely reap a rich reward in the possession of that affection unbroken and unbounded. Defend them against aggression from without, regulate their foreign relations, but leave them their freedom of judgment. Then it would be hard to say when the day would come on which they would wish to separate from the great name of England. They coveted a share in that name, and in that feeling of theirs would be found the greatest security for the connection. The greatest purchasers of books relating to Old English history were the Americans. The Americans who came over to England sought out and visited the scenes where the most remarkable events in British history had occurred, for they could not forget that they were equally the descendants of men who had made that history. Let the name of England be made more and more an object of desire to the colonies. Their natural disposition was to love and revere it. The present and past year had afforded some proofs of that. Various colonies, some of them lying at the Antipodes, had offered their contributions to assist in supporting the wives and families of British soldiers, the heroes who had fallen in the Crimean War. This was one of the first fruits of the system upon which had been founded during recent years a rational mode of administering the affairs of the colonies without gratuitous interference. There was every encouragement for the extension of that system. There was so much union of feeling among the public and in Parliament with respect to it, that he trusted they might look forward with the utmost confidence to its prevalence and progress. For his part, he should ever thankfully rejoice to have lived in a period when so blessed a change in British colonial policy was brought about, a transition from misfortune and evil, in some cases from madness and crime, back to the rules of justice, reason, nature, and common sense. End of The Gladstone Colony, an unwritten chapter of Australian history by James Francis Hogan. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia.